You stand as a witness to a grim scene. In the distance, the cold clang of metal striking stone echoes, a chilling prelude to what is about to unfold. Castration, more than just physical mutilation, was often a cruel ritual of domination and control. Here, humanity's darkest urges collide with the fragility of identity, blurring the line between authority and annihilation. Before we unravel 7 brutal methods history has tried to conceal, pause for a moment. If uncovering these forgotten truths fascinates you, make sure to like, subscribe, and share where you're listening from. Across time and space, it's remarkable how our shared curiosity binds us through such haunting legacies. The screams did not always end in death. Sometimes they lingered, raw, jagged, echoing through the hollow corridors of history. Castration was not only the severing of flesh but also the shattering of identity. A word heavy with cruelty, domination, and erasure. For centuries, it was a weapon wielded to break men's spirits, strip away power, and recast them as shadows in society. In ancient civilizations, castration was more than punishment. It was social engineering. It silenced bloodlines, erased futures, and turned individuals into instruments of control. The act tore through families and reshaped communities. It was both symbol and sentence, a mutilation louder than any words. And its permanence made it even more terrifying. Unlike other wounds, this one never healed. Survivors carried not only scars, but also rejection, isolation, and the stigma of otherness. Some became slaves, prisoners, traitors marked for life. Others, ironically, were elevated as eunuchs, placed in roles of trust near emperors and sultans. Yet even then, their existence was defined through the prism of mutilation. Their humanity filtered, reshaped, and scarred forever. The pain was indescribable. A searing wave through the body, with blood loss, infection, and death as constant companions. The act was often swift and merciless, carried out with cold efficiency. The flesh was broken, but the true violence lay in what followed. The erasure of identity, the silencing of lineage, and the branding of men as less than whole. Castration was never merely physical. It was psychological, cultural, and political. A brutal declaration that one man could own the body and future of another. The echoes of those screams still reverberate through history, a haunting reminder of humanity's darkest capacity for control. This is the threshold. Ahead lie 7 methods, each more harrowing than the last, by which castration was inflicted across time. The first, the simplest, yet among the most devastating, the blade. The knife was mankind's earliest and most ruthless tool of erasure. Sharp, cold, and absolute in purpose. In ancient Mesopotamia, treason and betrayal were punished by the cut of steel, an act that left both physical and symbolic scars. Flesh torn, blood spilled, voices silenced. The cut was merciless, often performed without care, leaving survivors mutilated and cast aside, their futures severed along with their flesh. In some societies, the mutilated became outcasts, stripped of honor and manhood. In others, they became tools of rulers, trusted precisely because of what they had lost. The blade destroyed, but in its cruelty, it also forged new identities. Identities built on suffering, necessity, and survival. Yet the process was crude. No surgeons, no anesthesia, only orders carried out with merciless precision. The blade carved not just into bodies, but into the very narrative of human history. Each cut was a rupture, tearing through flesh, identity, and the future itself. And always, there were screams of betrayal, fear, and the ultimate loss of control. The knife severed more than manhood, it severed humanity. Not in the eyes of their world, the blade stripped men of voice, power, and identity. It was not just the sharp sting of immediate pain, but the permanent erasure of self. The knife, crude yet absolute, stood as the earliest and rawest method of castration. It embodied both primal violence and deliberate control, a ritual of destruction carried out in cold steel. Beneath its edge, the victim faced a body reshaped, a future rewritten. The wound was more than physical. It unraveled the very sense of existence. The blade did not just cut flesh, it severed identity, lineage, and agency. It was a tool that spoke across centuries in the universal language of pain and domination. Its scars marked not only skin, but history itself. From this point, 7 methods of castration unfold. The blade is only the beginning, a cruel foundation upon which darker horrors were built. Simple in practice, devastating in consequence, its legacy is one of suffering, survival, and the relentless assertion of power through mutilation. But the screams did not always end with the knife. Sometimes they twisted into something else, into a torment that burned long after the cut. This was the agony of fire. The second method of castration turned heat into a weapon. In medieval Europe and across Asia, molten metal, boiling water, or searing irons were pressed against the body, blistering and melting flesh. Unlike the swift cut of a blade, this was a drawn-out annihilation. Time itself became an enemy as moments stretched into hours of relentless burning. Victims writhed in agony, skin charred, nerves ignited, hope consumed. Fire did not simply mutilate, it made a spectacle. In crowded courts and public squares, men were disfigured before the eyes of their peers. The message was clear: rebellion or betrayal would be reduced to ash. The flames scarred both body and mind. The psychological toll was immense: fear, shame, and the haunting memory of elemental torment. Fire was purifier and destroyer, turning manhood into smoke, and leaving only husks marked by its cruel signature. Survivors, rare and broken, bore wounds that never truly healed. Yet even this was not the limit. For in other places and times, castration became even more grotesque, handed over to beasts. The third method unleashed animals as living instruments of mutilation. Ferocious dogs, trained birds of prey, or other savage creatures were set upon prisoners, traitors, and enemies. Flesh was ripped apart by teeth and talons, blood spilled in chaos, and screams mixed with animal growls in a symphony of horror. Here, man became prey. His humanity stripped as he was reduced to trembling flesh under the jaws of beasts. The act was not only physical destruction, but profound humiliation, a descent into primal terror that crushed dignity. Few survived such ordeals. Those who did carried scars beyond the body, shame, helplessness, and nightmares that never faded. To be torn by animals was to be branded less than human, a grotesque spectacle meant to terrify all who witnessed. In these 3 methods, the blade, the fire, and the beast, we see not just mutilation, but deliberate domination. Each act was a weaponized ritual, designed to break men, silence voices, and etch obedience in blood and pain. The teeth and claws of the beasts carved wounds no surgeon could ever erase. The screams eventually died, but their echoes still lingered, wild, haunting, and unrelenting, a brutal testament to how far human cruelty could reach when wielding power through primal means. This was never just an act of mutilation. It was a ritual of terror, a ceremony designed to strip away dignity and humanity. Across history, 7 grim methods of castration emerged, each one darker and more grotesque than the last. The fourth was perhaps the most savage, using animals as both executioners and symbols of dehumanization. Here, chaos became a tool of control. The ferocity of beasts was unleashed upon the helpless, turning men into prey and their bodies into living reminders of terror. Victims bore scars that stretched beyond flesh, shattered minds, fractured spirits, and identities broken beneath the weight of primal violence. This was castration by animal attack, a barbaric fusion of nature's brutality and man's thirst for domination. But cruelty wore many masks. The next chapter of torment unfolded through chemical agents, silent, corrosive, and insidious. Unlike the immediacy of blade or flame, this 5th method crept slowly, dissolving flesh and spirit alike. Long before modern science, ancient civilizations had discovered the destructive power of caustic plants, minerals, and poisons. These substances were applied to the most vulnerable of organs, burning, blistering, and rotting tissue until nothing remained but pain and decay. Chemical castration was a war waged at the cellular level. It began with a sting, then an unbearable burn, until necrosis set in and infection devoured what was left. The body became a battlefield of chemical warfare, organs dissolving, nerves destroyed, bones gnawed by toxins. Survivors endured agony that never slept, their lives reduced to shadows marked by chronic pain, shame, and social exile. This was torture without spectacle, a slow unraveling that left scars no eye could see. The chemicals were indifferent, merciless arbiters that erased manhood not with a single cut, but with weeks or months of corrosive torment. From the shadows of ancient empires to grim experiments of later centuries, this method persisted as a weapon of domination. It stripped men of power, silenced desire, and left their very bodies betraying them day after day. It was both scientific and savage, a cruel foreshadowing of modern attempts to control sexuality through pharmaceuticals. The suffering was hidden, invisible, yet absolute. This was castration by chemical means, a quiet, corrosive erasure of identity and existence itself. And then came the crushing force. If chemical torment was a creeping death, this sixth method was swift annihilation. Flesh, bone, and identity were obliterated beneath hammers, stones, or mechanical presses. It was not merely removal but total destruction, a violent punctuation mark in the story of human cruelty. In arenas, prisons, and courts, heavy objects or vice-like devices were brought down with merciless finality. The blow shattered nerves, splintered bone, and left the victim writhing in an agony that consumed every fiber of the body. Blood gushed, flesh tore, and survival often slipped away in moments. For those who lived, existence became a lifelong sentence of pain, disability, and disgrace. Crushing was as much performance as punishment, a spectacle of domination meant to terrify all who watched. The body, once a vessel of strength and manhood, was reduced to ruin and shame. Survivors bore not only mutilation but the profound psychological void of seeing their very identity pulverized. It was subjugation in its rawest form, the sound of masculinity shattered beneath unrelenting weight. Whether by animal, chemical, or crushing force, each method revealed the same truth: power expressed through the destruction of flesh and the breaking of spirit. The screams eventually stopped, but the echoes remained, lingering like ghosts in history's darkest corridors. It was never just about pain, it was about the symbolic annihilation of manhood, reducing the most intimate parts of the body to fragments beneath an unforgiving weight. This method spoke in the raw language of force, one universally understood across cultures and centuries. Victims carried the scars of this violence in two realms: visible wounds carved into flesh and bone, and invisible wreckage etched deep within the mind. Their broken bodies became living testimonies to punishment delivered not with precision, but with overwhelming, merciless power. This was castration by crushing, a violent erasure of identity, a brutal declaration of dominance through blunt force trauma. From here, history turns into the shadow domain of ritual and faith, where castration took on meanings far beyond cruelty or punishment. In the seventh and final form, mutilation was not simply endured, it was sanctified. It became a ritual sacrifice, an offering woven into the fabric of devotion, transformation, and belief. The screaming did not always end in despair. At times, it dissolved into solemn chants, a silence heavy with faith and surrender. In ancient Mesopotamia, India, and Rome, castration became ritual, an act where flesh was offered to the gods, framed as purification, and exalted as a passage into sacred realms. The body was transformed into a temple, and the removal of manhood was cast as a grotesque rite of passage into spiritual servitude or divine favor. Blades and fire severed flesh while chants and prayers wrapped the suffering in sacred meaning. Pain itself was sanctified, twisted into holy suffering, and mutilation reframed as transformation. In Mesopotamian cults, priests and devotees laid down their manhood in devotion, their sacrifice a brutal gateway to purity. In India, certain sects practiced castration as a renunciation of worldly attachments, turning agony into a corporeal symbol of spiritual discipline. In Rome, the cults of Cybele and Attis demanded self-mutilation, dramatic public acts where blood and cries merged with ritual ecstasy. The body was not merely destroyed, it was remade, shifted from the profane to the sacred, from man to eunuch, from mortal servant to vessel of the divine. The trauma was immense, the wounds grievous, the pain beyond description. Yet beneath the horror lay a paradoxical transformation. The mutilated body was not seen as disgraced, but consecrated, a symbol of devotion, an embodiment of sacrifice. Voices rose not in screams of despair, but in hymns that turned agony into sacrament. Through ritual castration, pain became a bridge between flesh and the divine, a terrifying surrender that redefined suffering as transcendence. Socially, the castrated occupied ambiguous roles, both revered and reviled, marginalized yet entrusted, feared as outcasts but honored as intermediaries with the divine. Their mutilation marked them forever, their bodies bearing visible and invisible wounds, but also new identities sanctioned by faith. They lived as paradoxes, victims of cruelty and symbols of sacred power. And so, the final echoes of ritual castration linger, a haunting fusion of mutilation and meaning, cruelty and sanctity. It was never only about flesh, it was about transformation, about rewriting identity through the language of belief. 7 methods. 7 horrors. 7 brutal paths through which castration scarred history. Each was unique, yet all shared a common purpose: to dominate, to silence, to erase. Blades sliced flesh with merciless precision, fire devoured with slow torment, factories turned mutilation into industry, animals unleashed primal terror, chemicals corroded flesh and spirit alike, crushing force annihilated body and dignity, and ritual sacrifice wrapped violence in the vestments of faith. Each method carved suffering into the body, but the deeper wound was always to the self, to identity, to voice, to existence itself. Castration was a weapon against more than flesh. It was a weapon against lineage, masculinity, and power. It rewrote destinies, destroyed social bonds, and left survivors living as fractured shadows. The screaming has long ceased, but its silence remains, heavy, lingering, eternal. Through every age and culture, castration revealed humanity's darkest truth: the urge to wield power by destroying flesh, silencing spirit, and reshaping identity through cruelty. It was never just about mutilation, it was about domination, transformation, and the haunting reminder of how violence inscribes itself upon both body and soul.